Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for joining us tonight on this virtual program from the Sierra Club Falls of the James group. We are virtual because of the weather, and perhaps that's a good thing because we have a lot of folks able to join us tonight from all over the Commonwealth. You know, about the weather, everybody talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it. That's the old witticism, right? And sometimes in the past several years, I've felt that way about data centers. But that would be an error because there are a few far-sighted people who are trying to wake up our state and local governments and our fellow citizens about the perils of our frantic embrace of this kind of an energy hogging business sector. One of these people who has been sounding the alarm most prominently is our speaker, our ringleader tonight, actually. Dr. Mary Finley Brooke is an author, a parent, an educator, and as I've witnessed, a true role model. She is an associate professor of environmental studies and geography at University of Richmond. She's provided technical support to vulnerable communities cited for energy projects, and has published research articles with the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Finley Brooke served on the Governor's Advisory Council for Environmental Justice and on the steering committee of the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative. She will introduce her colleagues, her students, her collaborators tonight as they present. So on this cold winter's evening, let's give a warm Sierra Club welcome to the Mary Finley Brooke experience.
All right, sorry about those technical difficulties. I'm Dr. Mary Finley Brooke from the University of Richmond and the Department of Geography, Environment, and Sustainability. And I'm going to get us started tonight. And later you'll hear from Kyle Redican, Annie Evans, Kyle Jenkins, and Beth Sasamia. They'll introduce themselves as we get to those parts. If this was taking place in the Science Museum as we had all planned in person, we would have greeted you with a smile and a handout, and we would have let you choose whether you wanted digital or printed. And this was going to start a discussion of some solutions. Annie, if you could go ahead and put that in the chat for us. It's our beginning list, and we encourage you to contribute to these ideas as we go tonight. So here's an overview of our presentation. We had intended to have interactive educational resources at the beginning, and we will still share those at the end. With this Zoom format, we would encourage you to engage through the chat feature. And from the chat, Annie and Beth will be compiling questions for later in the program tonight. We are also open to you posting comments, articles, resources with additional information, or even case studies. We'll talk about a few, but we know there's so many more that could be covered. We will compile this information, and Sierra Club can share this with those later who have registered for this event. This will include the slide deck and the hyperlinks that are included as the speaker notes. So we've put in a lot of sources. We also know there is a wealth of experience in this Zoom. Feel free to share in the chat your name, where you're from, if you come from an impacted community. I know we have some folks on here already. I was just hearing from Aileen again about some concern about what's happening in Henrico. And if you work for an organization, let us know. For an overview of our presentation, we're going to explain how Virginia has become a data center hotspot. And then we'll talk about some of these consequences, including what has been described as demand shocks that will be coming in our near future. Then we're going to move to discuss some solutions, including policy, education, and climate action. One reason for the current and looming crisis of what I call AI overbuild and AI overshoot is because people, and this includes our policymakers, are thinking that this cute little cloud, this little puffy cloud, is what we're talking about when we talk about data storage in the cloud. And in fact, as many of you know, data storage looks much more like this on the right. And so the internet's impact is being disguised with words such as cloud. I often hear from people that it's important to define data centers, that many people tell me they didn't actually know what one was until they've started to talk to me about it. And so here in Virginia, I know many of us are more aware because we have them in our community, but I do think it's important to remember that as you're doing education, this is not something that people always know the definition of. And I think it's also important to discuss the anatomy of a data center. And by that, I mean making sure people understand that it links out to utility lines, that there's these not only distant generation of energy, but probably on-site generation, which is going to be your diesel backup, which is both very loud and can produce air pollution when those diesel generators are turned on, but that's so that you don't lose any data. There's also a lot the servers that are put into racks and then all of the cooling infrastructure. So making sure people understand what goes into this, but then also having a conversation about the size of the data center or the scale of the data center that's being described. So the industry name for our large ones are called hyperscalers. These are the ones that have at least 5,000 servers, and this is what's really being used for AI and for cloud computing. And what we need to know about these hyperscalers is that they use a lot more electricity and water. And so this is one of the reasons you often see kind of a wide range when people are talking about the impacts of data centers, is because they're kind of lumping together your regular standard data centers with your hyperscalers. So look at how much water can be used per year. Another thing that we want to keep in mind is that this hyperscaler data capacity is largely in the US, and that this growth is continuing, probably accelerating even from the rate that you're seeing here. But this is very much happening in the US. I would also really like to point out these fantastic maps that have been put out by Piedmont Environmental Council, and that can give us a good sense of what's been happening in Virginia. So in the lighter color of pink, you're seeing the data centers that have already been constructed. And we know that these had been almost 300, and many of these were hyperscale. What you then can see in the red there is how we have really gone from what was known as a data center alley in Northern Virginia to really cover a large part of the state. So certainly coming down through Virginia and then even extending out into these rural areas. So I think it's important for us to talk about how we got here, just to step back a moment and to recognize Virginia was, of course, home to the first subsea cable. And that certainly had something to do. But probably the biggest factor in why we have so many data centers is that the federal government has been the largest data client. And so from that initial stage until where we are now, the government of Virginia, the state of Virginia, has offered nearly $1 billion in incentives to attract data centers to our area. So we have ended up with a situation where Virginia is very much still dominant. You can see this through the the density of those cables, but also through the amount of traffic that is coming through our site. So this has continued to this day. And what many of you may have noticed starting, really in last December, is that the business world has started to pay attention to the fact that this is unsustainable, if we want to call it that. So this article came out in Bloomberg in December saying AI wants more data, more chips, more real estate, more power, more water, more everything. And so people are really recognizing that this is going to be much beyond the capacity of what was originally being imagined, and that we need to brace for what is being called these demand shocks. And so that's one of the things that we want to be thinking about, is how quickly this uptick has happened, and whether we've had any responsible governance in response. And some people have been really surprised. I think many of us who have been paying attention knew that this was happening. But I do want to point out one of the reasons that it could have been somewhat surprising for some people, and that's because these companies have made a lot of noise about their zero carbon and water positive commitments. But the truth of the matter is they're not meeting these targets. They're not anywhere near meeting these targets, and they're not being held accountable. This is not an industry that has been forced to be accountable. And so they really rely on voluntary carbon and water offsets. And so we can think of that in terms of what is happening with the company Amazon doing restoration in a watershed in California. Of course, that's not going to help these Virginia communities that are actually hosting the data centers. And so this is the situation we do find ourselves in, where Amazon Web Service has promised to make to be water positive by 2030, but a large portion of what they're actually doing are these replenishment projects in India, the UK, and the ones in the US have been largely in California. And so the trend that we have been seeing is that areas that face drought are recognizing that they just do not have enough water to cool down the data centers. So they're getting themselves into a situation that those of us who understand climate talk about water stranded asset and climate or carbon stranded assets. And so in this context, if you look at the map in the upper right, of course, Virginia looked very attractive, right? You can see all those large bodies of water, but think of the number of people who also live in these areas. And so I'm certain that these companies are thinking, and based on what has been happening, that they will have access to this water. But we need to be thinking not now, not just now, but into the future, and thinking about cumulatively that these data centers are using millions of gallons of water per day, and that this will compete with the needs that are there for other industry, but also residential and community uses. And that, of course, that these conflicts are going to increase over time. I've seen a lot of studies talking about, how much energy and water is used by ChatGPT. And I will say in 2023, there were several studies that were really pointing to as few as 5 questions could be using as much as 16 ounces of water. So we know that it's a range because it really depends on the efficiency of the site and where its energy is being drawn from or its water is being drawn from. But no matter what, this is really too much water usage. But the problem is larger than that, I have to say, because Amazon talks about being water positive, but they're only really measuring a small portion of the water use that they're responsible for. So those of us who look at the energy sector knows that energy, the electricity, will also have a huge water impact. And so when they're saying water positive, they're not including these other larger and extended uses. And so one of the things that I like to point out with data centers is how they define their boundaries. They put them very tightly around their site. And so they will tell us that their power usage efficiency or their water use efficiency is very high, but they're really only measuring a very small portion of the actual impacts. And they're ruling out all of this transmission and all of, for example, the gas lines that feed in. Some of you maybe will remember the article on the right that came out in the Washington Post in 2024. It's a really great interactive piece, but it was kind of shocking to a lot of people to find that new transmission lines are being built to coal for data centers in Northern Virginia. And we're seeing this trend all over the country. So certainly coal plants that were going to be shuttered are being kept online. New gas facilities are being built. We're finding nuclear facilities that were supposed to be shuttered are again being maintained online. And again, a lot of new nuclear is being proposed. So really having to think about these full impacts of water, not just what these data centers are describing as their impacts, it really can be very misleading. And then moving on to energy, we already know in Virginia the number now is 26%, so it's going up from even this number. One new data center would be able to provide enough electricity for 750,000 houses. So really think about how much that energy draw is and the impact that it is having on us in a time when we were transitioning to renewable energies as a state. And we can talk about those commitments and the extent to which they are really being undercut by the growth of these data centers. And so our largest utility and who would benefit the most from these data centers is Dominion Energy. And they're saying that they're really going to need to build new gas plants. But those of us who had been studying energy use in the state had known that the demand had basically was not growing, except for now this new burst of data centers. And so we really need to think about what this impact will be. And one of the examples that we could think of is happening right here. Chesterfield is where I live. And thinking about what Dominion Energy has said, they will need to build this massive new power plant. It's 100,000 megawatts of a gas-fired power plant. And they're saying it's for grid reliability, which, as we know, our grid is being made unreliable because of these data centers that have been approved without making sure that we have the electrical capacity. The community in Chesterfield has really pushed back quite a lot on this. And so what has happened is that the local government really has not made a decision about the siting because they have not held a hearing. They really have not listened to people to know about the siting, and instead are falling back. They moved where they're going to actually host this facility to fall back on a 2010 special use permit for a coal facility. And so this permit is really under negotiation right now. I hope people will be paying attention to it. It has, again, as I've said, been justified because of the need of energy for data centers. But one of the things that we know about this facility, kind of shown in the area of the P here, I was using EPA's EJ screen, which I'll talk a little bit more about, to look at the air toxics of the air in this part of Chesterfield. And you can see that it's in the 95 to 100th percentile when compared to the US. So there is a lot of really toxic industry in this area beyond the coal facility that had been there for many decades, already causing health concerns in what is a marginalized and vulnerable population. So it's really important to point out the need to understand the health in this area. And so one thing I will say is there's a community health study, and I see Dr. Fjord is on the line here. And so there will be a community health study around the Chesterfield power plant. But the other thing and so get in touch with us if you would like to find out more of this. It's happening in these next 5 months. But I would also want to point out what has happened with EJ screen data, that so many of us rely on information from the EPA. And if you go to look for this data, it has been taken down. And to point out how important it is to have access to this because of these disproportionate impacts. We know much industry is sited in locations of marginalized and vulnerable populations. So based on race, based on income, in this instance, it's also linguistic isolation. There's a lot of Spanish speakers. And so to be able to have data and to have information served out from the EPA for us to do this protective work is incredibly important. So to be paying attention that we don't have access to the data to be doing this ongoing work. To continue on, though, and not just look at this site, there's so many other examples that I could provide, again, in the chat if people want to be putting in ones that they know about. But one of the things I say to my students frequently is that you shouldn't only look at one scale or one location. So this idea of only paying attention to Virginia could be somewhat problematic. So one of the things I would encourage us to do is to look at what's happening across the border in North Carolina. We work, the environmental movement works quite a lot with folks in North Carolina because of environmental racism really being a pattern in both of these locations. And in this instance, we can see how this build out of data centers is connected to the pipelines, the gas pipelines, such as the Transco pipeline that's bringing that glutted gas from other parts of the country where they just have so much from their fracking, their hydraulic fracturing. And so all of this new infrastructure, whether it's the gas plants or the peaker plants or the compressor stations, is having harm to Black communities, to Native communities, and to rural low-income communities. And one of the situations that we know about that I wanted to mention, I'm hoping that people have been paying attention to the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which now has been completed. But the Southgate extension of the Mountain Valley Pipeline is back in the news. And one of the things that we know about this site is that it will carve open the Saponi, the native people of this area in North Carolina, the Saponi's homeland. And so in this picture on the right, you're seeing 7 directions of service, Crystal Cavalier Keck, and a lot of their work has been bringing attention to this problem. But I wanted to mention it because Crystal and Jason from 7 Directions of Service will be in Richmond for a residency in March, from the 17th of March. And they will be doing public events talking about this exact issue on March 20th, 21st, and 22nd. So please be in touch if you'd like to learn more about how this gas build out is very much connected to data centers. I'm going to move on from here and think about a question that I get a lot. Are there better locations? And I want to say yes. And then I also want to really kind of be clear about what the problems would be, even if you were putting things in the best possible location. So you're looking at a rendering here of coal country. And so the proposal was to build data centers in an area where the water has already been contaminated. So you're not using fresh water for cooling. That is obviously a good idea. We don't want to be using drinkable water for something that there's going to be a lot of chemicals added to and that you won't be able to use afterwards. So certainly there are locations that are better. Another one where there's research that's being done is actually underwater. And so if you put data centers underwater, you have a 40% increase in efficiency. Also putting them in colder environments, you maybe don't have to do as much cooling. So all of this makes sense, but we need to be really realistic about what we're talking. We're not going to be able to do ideal siting when we have just this incredible growth and these major hyperscale needs. And so in this picture, you're seeing what I would call energy sprawl with your solar and your wind. And certainly, yes, we do want to be putting as much of this on renewables as we can. But the problem is the needs of data centers are so massive that you're just not going to be able to use that much solar or wind to be able to meet these massive needs. We really have to be thinking about how to shift the design and to improve efficiency and to really make sure that companies are building with the best available technology, and they are not. They definitely are putting in as much as they can very quickly, and that means that they're really doing energy grabs and water grabs instead of building better technology. I could come back and continue on that for a very long time. But the point that I kind of want to make whenever thinking about coal fields or wherever thinking about these rural communities where these data centers and power plants are going in, that, what we're worried about with the ethics of AI is really some of these same ethics that we have to look at in the energy sector. And it's not just about developing AI, but in the governance of AI. So can we make sure there's transparency, justice, fairness, responsibility, accountability? Can we make sure that this harm is not happening? And to be able to do that, I think we need to be really clear on what are some of the ethical concerns with AI. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. There are so many of them. But if people have been paying attention to what's happening at the federal level right now, I think you're probably more aware of the potential for misuse of sensitive data or this unwanted sharing for personal data for trainings. And so really being aware of these ethical issues, I think, is super important. And I think a lot of us are getting our eyes open for the first time, just really what some of these risks are. But I want to talk about some issues of equity that I think often don't get enough coverage. So in geography, we frequently talk about something that is called a digital divide, and it's looking at this inequality in access. And so if you look at the map on the right, that's Amazon Web Services global network. Obviously, you can see that the coverage is not everywhere in the globe equally. The map on the left, on the bottom, is looking at our broadband coverage in the state of Virginia, which people who follow this know there's really been a lot of development in the last few years, but we still have a lot of places in our rural areas that coverage is very spotty. And the point to be made with this is that technology advantages some, and so people who do not have access to it, it can increase the gap between those who are able to benefit and those who are not able to benefit. So there's really can be an increase in equity as a result of this technology that seems so great to people who have access to it, but they're not recognizing the disadvantages of people who do not have access to it. I could go on and on about inequity issues. I did want to bring up another one that sometimes people are not aware of, but the employment in the data center industry is incredibly male dominated. And the truth of the matter is that this has not been getting better over time, and in fact has gotten worse in this most recent build out. So the percentages of males who are employed in the sector and females who are employed in the sector is completely uneven and has stayed that way. So there's, again, other topics that I could be covering in terms of inequity, but keeping kind of on this issue of gender imbalance, this goes up to the top, as many of us know. Again, if you're paying attention to what is happening at a federal level, the amount of money and power behind these corporations and the ability to really be very disruptive to our democracy, again, I think has been pretty astonishing to people, but really understanding how this power has been leveraged could potentially make us more aware of things that need to be done moving forward. So certainly these global actors and national actors with such strength and power are functioning here in Virginia with the largest data center market in the world. You can see Microsoft, Amazon, Google, et cetera. And so, is Virginia doing enough? And one of the things that I can tell you about Virginia's AI policy is that actually we're doing a lot more than many states. That I do not think says that we're doing enough, but certainly that we have put in place more things than other states. It seemed like potentially that this General Assembly in 2025 was going to move forward on a series of bills. So there were 7 bills put forth in front of the House and 4 in front of the Senate. Unfortunately, if you look at what has happened to these, if you look at our legislative information service, these links could be put in the chats if anybody wants to see. I have live links where people can kind of follow how this has been happening kind of in real time. What you will see here is that all of those House bills at the top that are saying in committee died in committee. They did not make it to crossover. So we do still have 1 Senate bill on the bottom there that is still seeming to work through the process. And so it survived crossover. It does address high risk artificial intelligence. It's that SB 1214. But I would point out that it's looking at use by public bodies. And I would suggest that we actually need to be making sure we're keeping track of what's happening in the private sector and that we look at other forms of protections. But perhaps people don't know what high risk AI is. And I'm going to be honest that I myself was not really clear at what this was until looking at this issue in this legislative cycle. And so if you look at what was being discussed in high risk AI, it is everything we do every single day. Like this is very much things that we need to be paying attention to and protections that we all should be concerned about. And I made a little bit of a mistake last night when I was putting final slides together, and I actually went searching for Virginia high risk AI and inadvertently actually asked AI. And so I thought it was really fascinating, the answer that came out, because AI can tell you just how dangerous this is and that this is about discrimination, right? This is to protect us from discrimination. And anybody who has studied the history of AI knows that it is discriminatory. It really depends on the data sets it's being trained on, but there has been a pattern of both racial and gender discrimination. And so this is really something to be paying attention to. And AI can tell us to be concerned about this. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, though, and talk about education because the tech programs in Virginia have been very gung-ho, not only, of course, about computer science, but about what they're seeing as the growth of AI. And I want to be pointing out, as we're training this generation, as we're thinking about these issues, that we really do need to make sure that it's not just the kind of these technical pieces or kind of some rote discussion of security or privacy, but really getting into many of these ethical issues. And so we have an opportunity, the University of Richmond, and full disclosure, would also like to be part of this boom of AI. And so we are going to be opening a center this year, Center for Liberal Arts and AI. And I think there is a real opportunity here to be discussing holistically really some of these concerns and thinking about what it does mean for our students and for our alums and for all of us moving forward. And so that brings me to the title of the talk. I had seen Silicon Valley of the East used for Northern Virginia and for Virginia multiple times, and I really hadn't thought very much of it. But when I saw it for this master's degree, as I was starting to think about a title for this talk, I decided to run with it for 2 reasons, because it was talking about education. And I'm somebody who teaches environmental studies, and when I teach environmental studies, I have always used the Silicon Valley as a case study of an area with the microchips where they fouled their water and they fouled their air, and they did it to such an extent that you can see it today, right? So Silicon Valley for me is a lesson of what not to do. And the other reason that I decided to bring it in is those of you who are from the University of Vermont know that we fly a lot of students, faculty, and staff, sometimes multiple times a year, to the Silicon Valley to study sustainability. And one of the things that I would like to mention to my own institution is that we are here contributing a lot of data. We actually have Spider AI. So we are contributing to these data centers. And so I think we have a responsibility as an institution to be part of the solution and to actually know that this is happening. I have a feeling if I spoke to people who go on that Silicon Valley trip, they don't actually even know the problems that we have here in Virginia as a result of data centers, or why that we even are called the Silicon Valley of the East. So I would encourage people on the education level to really understand what is happening here, and to make note of the fact that Amazon understands how important Virginia is and calls Virginia home. Amazon Web Services had the first servers here. They really understand how important this site is. And Virginia is also the site, as you may know, of the Amazon HQ2. And so looking at this building, we see both a shiny object and also some, you would think maybe some discussion of greenness, right? There's some discussion of sustainability in the presentation of that architecture. So I would like to look further at, kind of their sustainability pledges. On one level, I don't think we want to focus on just one company, but because Amazon claims to be setting the standards globally for water, I think it is fair to look at what they were doing. And so they have said everywhere and very loudly that they're planning to be water positive by 2030. And I said earlier that they're not meeting these goals. In fact, what I have seen, the last time I had looked, they were at 44%. And last night when I was going to get this, I went and took a screenshot. They're at 41%. So I'm wondering if there's actually even some slippage here, but they are certainly not on the way to be water positive by 2030. And they make a lot out of the fact that they use recycled water. So one of their sites, they say they have 20 globally. One of these sites is in Virginia. In a minute, I'm going to talk about another proposed site that I know of that would use recycled water, but this is just not happening at the scale that it needs to happen. So I will remind you, if you don't know, that Northern Virginia has more than 50 Amazon Web data centers, right? So globally, they have 20 with recycled water, and just in our region, we already have more than 50. So again, pointing out some of these relationships with water. What you're seeing on your bottom left there is the ANA data centers. And so these are going to be, as an agreement between Dominion and Amazon Web Services, to be developing nuclear capacity at that site. So again, thinking about water and energy and climate tying together. This site I want to mention a little bit further. This was the one that I was mentioning potentially that there's going to be water recycling, the Mattaponi Tech Campus, which is right on the border between Spotsylvania and Caroline counties. If you know much about this facility, fantastic, because I've been doing a lot of research and it's hard to come by information. There's been a couple of articles. Again, I'll thank the Piedmont Environmental Council for this mapping. It's very hard to get information, besides the fact that we know that these negotiations are in process. These sites are supposed to be happening, but what the agreements are, where the water comes from before it gets recycled or where it's discharged, is not easily available. But if you know this area and you know the Matt River, you know that that feeds into the Mattaponi River. And so part of the concern is that there will be these water implications for the Mattaponi tribe, who have already had conflicts. And so this is one of the story maps that has been made by students. Hopefully we can be sharing this in the chat or later. But if you know, in Caroline, this has been a huge controversy for many years now. This was supposed to be getting water for data centers and residential use, but it was really not being done in a transparent way. The latest is that the county was trying to take some land from a farmer for that water intake coming out of the Rappahannock. And so this has been caught up in a legal fight because that was a conservation easement that farmer had. But there's also a new study that's happening in the Rappahannock River where this water would be taken from. The idea would be that it would discharge into the Mattaponi River. And the concern of the Mattaponi is that they have not been consulted. If you know, they call themselves, "We are the people of the river." You can see their reservation and their homeland as currently. And why I would say that their homeland and their sovereignty is under threat is they are redeveloping a fish hatchery, if you've been following this. And so they had a fish hatchery on site until 2002. They want to be redeveloping it, of course, for food for people in the tribe, but also then for entrepreneurship. So this is a really, really important restoration project. And they have not been consulted about these data centers that are going to be upriver. They will certainly change the chemistry of the water. They've been told that it will change the flow of the water, potentially, again, the pH, the temperature maybe will change upriver, but we don't know what that would do to the whole ecological system. So this is the type of thing that needs to be taken into consideration. I'm going to move on from this example, but again, in the chat, maybe people want to bring in other examples that they've heard of. These are the types of impacts that we are going to have on the ground as a result of this data center build out. But it also requires all this energy, as we've been talking about. So understanding how much it's going to grow, and that these power plants, these transmission lines, they're all impacts in communities. And so understanding that there's going to be additional impacts. And one of them that people often want to find out more information about, and then don't necessarily like the news that they get, is who's going to pay for this data center expansion. And the answer is the customers. So that's you and me. And so our electrical bills will absolutely increase as a result of this. And so this brings in the really important work of the many people and organizations that are part of the Virginia Data Center Reform Coalition, because one of their major or 4 pillars of data center reform is this protections for families and businesses. And that's exactly what we're talking about, is making sure that families and businesses are not paying for all of this build out of data centers and of electrical transmission and power plants that we're not necessarily needing or even wanting. And that's part of the reason to need to have these efficiency incentives. Again, the amount of energy that's being used and the amount of water that's being used is totally unnecessary. It's because these technological innovations that do exist are not being brought into our data centers, because nobody's holding these data centers accountable. Again, so if you move to the enhanced transparency and state oversight, this is exactly what we need. So is this what we are getting? I had a student do research with me last summer and with others in the Spatial Analysis Lab, Dr. Redican and others. And what we were looking at was what the policy has come out of Virginia. And so what Wenyi was showing here in blue is the bills that would facilitate, so those that create incentives to attract data centers, and then red, those are ones that would regulate some of the potential harms from data centers, whether it's the noise, whether it's the damage to historical sites or natural areas, whether it's not using energy efficiency or water efficiency standards, all of the many important bills that have been put forward. But what you'll see in 2024 is none of those bills were put forth. And so if you remember, what happened is that our legislators decided to punt, and I'll call it that. And what they wanted to do was to hear back from JLARC, our Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, did an almost year-long study that they then put out the findings of this past December. And so basically the policymakers were saying, well, let's have this study and see where we're at. And I'm going to tell you some of the findings, but one of the ones that I think is really important, I put on the right here. And that is that we really need to be thinking about stranded assets. Are customers going to be caught paying for infrastructure that was put in that we're not going to be able to continue into the future? So I think that's a fantastic question, and something that Dominion Energy needs to be asking in all of its permitting. But what was the finding that came from JLARC? For those of us who had been paying attention, there was no surprises here. I love it when Ivy Main put out this story on December 24th, 2024. We suspected data centers were creating an energy crisis for Virginia. Now it's official. And if you saw what the JLARC study said, it was basically that we need a lot more gas. We need a lot more nuclear facilities. We're going to be importing more energy. And we've really got some serious problems. So they said it in very stark language on their terms. I think it needs to be really repeated what of a crisis we've gotten ourselves into. And so you would think in the General Assembly that just started in January that there would be a lot of momentum on the part of our legislators to be thinking about bills that would be protecting people. And unfortunately, there's a pattern that you can see here. And the one that I have to point out that says it's in committee, I will say that it died in committee. It did not make it into crossover. And so This is our legislative information system. Again, there's a live link that you can be following things. And if you search for data centers, which I did next, again, I think you're going to be seeing a pattern here. So many of these bills are failing. The one that says incorporated, I will tell you it was incorporated into the bill that I just said died in committee from the previous slide. So we still do have two bills open. And I want to talk about them briefly and do just a little bit of overview of what this policy is doing before I'm going to pass things over to Kyle Redican. But to say that the bill that is still standing at the top there, HB 1601, does look like an active bill. It was put forward by Representative Josh Thomas. And so some of you maybe have seen that he's put forward other siting bills for data centers. And the last thing I will say about policy is, yes, we're taking some baby steps. It does look potentially like this bill will survive. In the chat, those of you who are following this minute to minute, if you want to fill us in if there's more information. But it does look like we might take a baby step here, but we are not in a situation where we should be taking only baby steps. Really, we have all the signals to know that we need to be doing much more on policy levels, and then we can talk about some other solutions that are very much necessary. So I'm going to stop my sharing here and pass things over to Kyle Redican.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Kyle Redican. I'm one of Mary's colleagues at the University of Richmond. And one of the things that we were really inspired for when we were working last year with a couple of students was some of Josh Thomas's bills on siting. Those kind of inherently geographical. So it gave a really good opportunity to try to create some cool tools that would allow us to be a little bit kind of get both some of the geographic and some of the kind of impacts that we could have. So one of the students, Sydney Cassidy, excuse me, worked on this data centers app that was based around House Bill 337 from last year. Again, like the bills Mary was saying, it didn't end up actually going all the way through. But that bill was talking about preservation of historic, cultural, environmental, and education resources in Virginia, saying that you can't be within a half mile. So what we did was we created this instant app where you can look for anywhere in Virginia, any address that you can put into it. So if we put in Richmond address, University of Richmond. Turn away. What it's going to do is take you to the actual site, and then it's going to tell you what historic sites are possibly around it within a half mile, or you could set that buffer longer. A half mile was what the bill originally kind of said, but it also can show what parks and what historic resources or schools might be around it. So it's a really good tool that you can kind of use to see some of the siting locations and some of the new kind of possibilities of places where it could go and some where those impacts would actually kind of be. But this works for anywhere in the state of Virginia. Any address that you put in, and it'll tell you kind of what's within whatever that kind of buffer area would possibly be there. So it's just an example of one of the kinds of tools and one of the ideas that we're kind of going into as we're kind of working on sustainability with data centers a little bit more. So now I kick it over to Annie Evans, who's going to talk about some of the other work that we've done here.
Thanks, Kyle. Hi, everybody. My name's Annie Evans, and I'm a colleague of both Mary and Kyle and the others at the University of Richmond. I actually support a digital humanities project called New American History, but in my downtime, I'm also the co-coordinator of an organization called the Virginia Geographic Alliance. So I actually met Mary through that organization way before I came to U of R. We've been around for over 30 years, and one of the things that we support is teachers, K-12 and higher education, educators engaging together across grade bands, across the state. And so Mary pitched this idea to us that wouldn't it be great if the folks at U of R Geography Department and other departments could work with the K-12 teachers to kind of unpack what is happening here in Virginia, share their wealth of knowledge, and then help the K-12 teachers develop lessons. So this is the flyer that we created, and we had I was very happy to see that we had teachers from across the state, Tidewater, Central Virginia, Nova, and even the far Southwest participating, meeting together. We held a digital Saturday module, sort of a boot camp to get them all up to speed. And then we sort of turned them loose. We had check-ins, we had short webinars. Beth taught them everything about story maps, which is a free platform that all K-12 educators have access to. We shared some story maps tonight. And on the next slide, we want to showcase one of the projects that just sort of blew us all away. And had we met in person, I actually drove up to Arlington and picked up this actual model, hoping to show it to you in person. But one of the art teachers from Arlington County Schools became interested in this topic and wanted to use, you've probably heard about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. It gets a lot more attention than geography and history, to be quite honest with you. But STEAM has picked up, they've had the letter A there for the arts. And so I'm a big proponent of doing things in a cross-curricular way. So this art teacher started off by introducing data centers using the materials that Kyle and Mary and Beth and others shared. And her students decided that they wanted to build a 3D model, which you see here in the image in its preparation and the building stages. And they flew drones over a data center located very close to their school there in Arlington. And then they used a technique called felting. It's a craft that where they showed how the impact of heat and the amount of water that was being used for these data centers is sort of impacting the foliage and the flora and fauna in the vicinity closest to this data center. So then they did some more investigation. If you go to the next slide. So they built this model, which is incredible. It's even more incredible in person. And towards the end, one of the young men said, what if, and he had a receipt in his backpack. And I think he'd been to a convenience store or something, or Walmart the night before. And he said, what if we had receipts coming out the windows to show how much money is involved? And I just thought, someday these kids are going to run the world. It's going to be a much better place. So they took this show on the road. Next slide, please. They took this show on the road. They talked to their PTA. They talked to their school board. They talked to their board of supervisors. And let me tell you, in the future, these kids have great ideas. They came up with a path forward. They had some really concrete ideas that they wanted their local leaders and state leaders to take action. And so I am very encouraged with this generation of future geographers and teachers because the kids got it right. So we welcome you. I put the links to all of the lessons. Please share them with every teacher you know. And our emails are at the end of these slides. Any K-12 teacher that wants to engage in this sort of work, we want to figure out a way to help them. So please pass it along. Thank you, Kyle and Mary and everyone.
Pass this over to Kyle Jenkins.
What's up here? Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Kyle Jenkins. I'm one of the social sciences librarians at the University of Richmond, and also the first-year instruction coordinator for the library. I'm with this group because I'm also the geography liaison with the Department of Geography on campus. So just as a quick kind of background as to the role of why librarians kind of in the mix with geography professors and other faculty here, we at the university do a number of different, have a number of different tasks and responsibilities. One of them is kind of direct research support for students and faculty. Some of them is also working, as I said, directly with disciplinary groups across campus. And another big part of our position is to curate resources for kind of campus and community use. That not only involves some of the work that we do on campus, but it involves some of the other groups that are conducted with our university library, such as our book arts, archives, and rare book space, and our digital scholarship lab. You might have seen some of those resources floating around. But in connection with Mary Finley Brooke and the rest of the team here was asked to kind of create a research guide or a library guide for all of the information on data centers across Virginia. So in the slide presentation, the link to the resource guide is either you can click on the picture or it's in the link in the bottom. But just to show you some of the resources that you have accessible through, or that are accessible through the guide, what we've tried to do is get a collection of news reports, open access scholarly literature, and other links to other key resources related to everything that you've seen today, not only as a manner to either use for community use to provide people access to these resources and provide this introduction to data centers across Virginia and really the problem as it is nationally speaking, but to really act as a repository for some of this information. So to show you an example of what some of these pages look like on the kind of general cloud computing and data centers page here, We've got a number of featured resources, some of these again that you've seen in the presentation today, everything from the data centers map to data centers carbon footprint calculators to a wide range of other resources available on the side, to a collection of articles coming, again, nationally and centered across Virginia. We felt it's really important not only to kind of keep people up to date with what's happening as it relates to data centers, but kind of tracking the problem back. So we have articles from here as early as 2020, some as early as 2019, 2015 in some pages. But that really is much of the idea for having a guide like this, is to have that repository of information that allows people to track back these topics to see how long they've been at issue, see how discussions have evolved and kind of changed over the preceding years, and then provide, kind of quick, easy access to some of those specific aspects of the information as well. We've got a whole page here dedicated to artificial intelligence its connection with data centers, not only featuring some of the story maps, but again, wide range of other news reports and other resources. There's a page here entirely dedicated to data centers within Virginia, broken up topically here by issues of finances, energy, environment, and then governance and kind of oversight and accountability. There's a wide range of news reports here that are broken up by different locations across Virginia. So noting where data centers are cropping up, and as news reports become available, we're kind of updating them here. Data centers by different companies. So understandably, Amazon and HQ2 is kind of a major focus, so that's kind of the major collection that we've got here, but they're broken up by Google and Microsoft as well. And as well, a few resources dedicated to the aspect of finding solutions and how we're kind of moving past and forward beyond data centers across Virginia and really nationally here. So again, really the point of having a collection like this and having a repository like this is to make this publicly available. This isn't restricted just to U of R staff, students, and faculty. This is something that all of you have access to and can look through a lot of the resources that are there. And the fact that we're not only from news reports to some of the scholarly literature, really trying to prioritize this publicly available and open access literature to have that transparency and access available to anyone that wants to utilize these resources. Considering the past few weeks as well, I'd be remiss if I didn't drop in a quick mention to support your local librarians, be they public or higher ed based, because this work of preserving, maintaining access to these resources is ever more important and will continue to be so going into the future. And know too that this is a guide of information that we will continue to update as the situation evolves. I'll be working with Mary, Kyle, and the rest of the team here to make sure this is as up to date as possible. One other thing I forgot to mention as well is on the data centers page, on top of all of the suggestions that y'all have been dropping in for additional resources, on the bottom of the homepage here, not only do you have all of our contact information here on the side, we've got a link to a publicly available Zotero library for any of those using that resource manager as a means to kind of collect resources. We've got a link to a feedback form here. So if there's any resource you want to see added to this guide, suggestions for new pages for the guide, kind of keeping, again, that open transparency, please feel free to drop some information there. We'd love to see that. And know too that beyond resources we've got in this guide, as was mentioned previously, we do have access, and you all have access to a wide range of other story maps that have been created by Mary Finley Brooke, the rest of the team here in the Geography department at U of R, that are going to be accessible through our page at the Spatial Analysis Lab here. All the links are set up in this page as well. But yeah, I think before we wrap up, also wanted to pass this back to Eileen so we could show the video we were looking to get at the beginning of the presentation here. So stop sharing my screen. I'll turn it back over to Eileen.
Can you hear it? Artificial intelligence is revolutionizing industries, but behind the innovation lies a hidden crisis. The Commonwealth of Virginia has become the global hub for data centers, powering AI advancements. However, with this rapid expansion comes a staggering cost: energy shortages, water depletion, skyrocketing utility bills, and environmental destruction. Who benefits and who pays the price? Today, up to 70% of the world's internet traffic flows through data centers in Northern Virginia, serving as an epicenter for hyperscale data center development. These facilities now consume about 26% of Virginia's total electricity, with hyperscale centers owned by Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Meta driving an unprecedented surge in demand. A 2024 state audit warned that Virginia cannot meet this demand, even as policymakers approve permits at breakneck speed. Meanwhile, ratepayers, ordinary Virginians, will bear the brunt of rising costs. AI isn't just energy hungry, It's water thirsty. Data centers require millions of gallons per day to cool their servers, draining local water supplies and threatening communities. With AI expansion accelerating, shortages will only get worse, yet many tech giants refuse to disclose their water consumption. In the US, other states have already taken action to address the crisis. In Ohio, lawmakers are working to ensure that corporations, not residents, pay for costly new transmission lines. Virginia must follow suit. Solutions do exist to generate greater sustainability in the sector. Mandating 100% renewable power data centers, requiring companies to disclose energy and water usage, giving local governments more authority over new developments, and placing limits on AI-driven energy expansion. We must ensure data centers and artificial intelligence serve the public good, not just corporate profits. The AI revolution shouldn't come at the expense of our homes, our resources, and our future. We need stronger regulations, corporate accountability, and a plan that balances innovation with sustainability. While addressing this issue may seem overwhelming, your voice and actions matter. You can drive change by urging local representatives to pass legislation that assesses the community impact of data centers, demands greater transparency in resource consumption, and enforces energy conservation practices. On a personal level, you can take steps to reduce your digital footprint, using AI technologies more selectively and minimizing unnecessary usage. Seeking ethical, sustainable alternatives to platforms like X, Meta, Microsoft, and Google. And when possible, spending less time online and more time engaging with the physical world. The decisions we make today will define the future of AI and the communities it impacts.
Thanks, Siobhan.
Well,
Mary, do you want to share your slides?
Thank you. Pardon?
If Mary wants to share her slides to finish up.
Yeah, I think we did have a solutions guide that we were loving to have feedback on. And I saw at least one question that I would love to have us address. I had seen a question about the contaminants that were put in water. And so to address, part of the problem with that is these companies are not required to disclose what they put in, but they do put in chemicals for several reasons. And one would be to prevent corrosion of their equipment. They say that they absolutely need to be doing this to protect their equipment and also to make the process more efficient. But there are a lot of chemicals. We know that it is not water that you should be drinking, but we don't always get a full list of everything that has been put in. I could send lists of more information, but I did want to mention that we do know that there are a lot of chemicals put in, and that this is of huge concern to communities. And that water is more obviously efficient for cooling than air, although there are air technologies. And that's one of the things that the data centers say that they're able to do is direct air cooling. That uses more energy. So please keep in mind the amount of water that would go into the production of whether it's going to be coal or gas or whatever. Nuclear, it also needs water for cooling. And so by doing that direct air cooling, it's supposed to be a sustainability solution, but it then causes another problem. So I'm not sure if I fully answered that question, but I think it's a really important one. Looking at the impacts of water could not be more important. And folks that were looking at the questions, I didn't know if there were any other ones that we were going to answer, and then looking at the sustainability guide and seeing if people had suggestions. And I believe, Aileen, you had a couple of slides on future events, but that was on your slides, not mine.
Did you want any? Are you guys done with the questions then? I take it no more questions for the team?
I know that I think I wrote somebody on Facebook today asked about how they can, try to lessen their use of AI. And I guess the video just kind of talked about that. So I think that answered that question.
And there were additional suggestions.
Uh-huh.
I put something in the chat as well that at least for Google's search results, that while you can hide those results coming up on your screen, it's currently no option for an opt-out. So everyone is baked into using at least Google searches AI just by default.
Okay, thank you.
And there was a question that just popped up, how best to organize. And, I'd love to hear other folks' opinion on this. For me, it's all hands on deck. I think part of the problem is a lot of people don't know what's happening. So education is really an important area for us to start. If you aren't a member of the Data Center Reform Coalition, that's a fantastic group that has been having an impact. Many of us were involved in the lobby day that happened on January 20th. But what we also know is that as many people who showed up from these impacted communities and for people that were concerned, the lobbyists for the data center industry were there with a massive show of force. And so really making sure that people know what's happening and kind of what we're up against is one of our first steps. And then our regular organizing strategies that we're going to have to use, really come at it from all directions. It is policy, it is education, and it's climate action. And so we've got lots of experienced organizers on this call that can tell us about some events for climate action. So go ahead, Aileen. I know you want to talk about these next events. This is one of these organized activists that I'm talking about, experienced. Aileen Rivera.
Yeah, Joe, if you don't mind, I'm gonna jump in here with a community impact study. This is all related also to what all the work that Mary is doing, and we have some of our Falls of the James Sierra Club members too that are participating in the study. And we actually happen to have Lakshmi here, Fjord, here on the call. If she doesn't mind talking a little bit, this will be like 2 minutes to let you know what's happening with this study and how you can help. Lakshmi, do you want to talk a lot about this just really quick? Did I miss her? You're muted.
Of course, I just took precious time to unmute. I'm so sorry. Yeah, this is our community. This is our flyer. Perhaps you all understand that the gas plant needs to have an air permit, and it's already been filed. In that air permit, Dominion admits and says that, most of the people that are surrounding this gas plant in the 3-mile radius are either minority, majority, or they're linguistic isolated, or they're low income. But they put in this caveat that they're potential EJ communities. So what are we doing? We are mounting a very swift, only 2 months to do this, with 2 weeks really basically to set it up, to get up to 450 interviews of households in the 3-mile impact area. And what we need to do is get evidence that can be used as, forms of reasons to deny the permit. And why is it that? Because they know that this is an EJ community, but we have to prove it. So we are going to be finding out household sizes, ages, race, and ethnic backgrounds. We want to find out existing health conditions and even persistent symptoms, because part of the statute talks about degree of injury to health and safety. So we need to kind of actually have a sense of what amounts and sorts of conditions are already in these communities, and that would then have increased exposure risks. Also, because the statute mentions use of property. We are also asking about how outdoor spaces are used because we were concerned about the extra emissions that would impact people being outside. We're also asking about community heritage, the historic sites, and then also family networks, because then there's even a greater disproportionate impact on people whose families have been there for generations and generations, are still living there. And so it's it's just a much worse situation for them. So what do we need? I talked about, we actually need community leaders, people who live, work, volunteer, have roots in that 3-mile area to help us recruit those households, because as they are minority majority, they're immigrant families, they're people under threat even more now. So they have to have sort of a sense of trust in the people who are doing the interviewing. So we would like to have interviewers who have some connection in the community, and we're doing recruitment. So what you see is a flyer, and we have a web page that hasn't yet been published, which is being kindly hosted on the Friends of Chesterfield webpage. But we have an event, a community event, that I'd like you all to think about attending, or letting us know if you can, or other people that you might encourage to come, on February 22nd, as you can see on the flyer, at the Chester Library. And if you need to just have like an easy way to reach out, I'm just going to give you my email address, but know that Glenn is part of this team. Mary Finley Brooke Glenn Besa is part of this team. Aileen is part of this team, and Mary and Beth Zazamia is doing our mapping. So don't email her about attending events, but my email is my name, Lakshmi, LAKSHMI .fjord, F as in Frank, JORD, @gmail.com. And I would love to hear from any and all of you. And we can have a much more calm and quiet conversation, and we can figure out how you could help make sure that we get at least 400 interviews in this area, so that we can have solid evidence that can be used either to deny the air permit or to appeal an air permit that's approved. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Lakshmi. And we will, like Lakshmi mentioned, there will be a website linked into the Friends of the Chesterfield that you can find out more information if you're interested. And then we're moving right along to our next information. Joe, where are you?
Excuse me, Aileen, a quick question for Lakshmi. Lakshmi, you said the date of your event. You said the 22nd. The flyer says the 19th, I believe.
Oh, well, there's a small 19th event, but actually that room is too tiny, and it's for faith leaders. So really, we're trying to point people toward the February 22nd event. It's the large room, and it's meant for everybody. Thanks for asking that. That's so, yeah. Good catch.
Thank you.
Joe.
Oh, yes. Pardon me. All right. Thank you, Aileen. And now for a few announcements. When we meet in person at the Science Museum of Virginia, you're invited to bring used, hard-to-recycle batteries, and we will take those. Next, Beyond Methane RVA is a wonderful volunteer campaign focusing on the municipal gas utility in Richmond. Would love to have folks volunteer with that. You can see the website there, beyondmethanerva.org. Trying to get some oversight of the city's gas utility. Also doing testing, both outdoors for gas leaks in the pipeline system, and when people agree, indoors at their homes to see if gas appliances are, caught damaging their health in their very homes. On the 28th, the annual Great Backyard Bird Count. Actually, it looks like it's from February 14th, this Friday, over this coming weekend. And can we scroll on that? All right, we have a hike coming up on February 22nd. That is at 9 a.m. at Powhatan State Park. Powhatan State Park for a 5-mile hike, and there's a registration link there. On February 27th, Friends of Chesterfield, the volunteer organization which is explicitly formed to oppose the gas plant, is having an event at 6 p.m. And for information, you will see a link there. I believe that is at a library in Chesterfield. And our next, well, let me come back to that. On March 15th, which is a Saturday, we are having volunteers do a day of service, a morning of service at the Science Museum of Virginia to show our appreciation for them for hosting us there for our programs this year. And so if you can come out that morning and do some hands-on outdoor work in the garden there, that would be fantastic from 9 a.m. to noon. And our next program is 4 weeks from tonight, March 11th. And our speaker is Dr. Damian Pitt of Virginia Commonwealth University. That evening, we'll be looking at the impacts of utility scale solar development. So two back-to-back extremely important issues in the Commonwealth. Tonight, data centers, and in 4 weeks, looking at utility scale solar. Because of the topic that night, I guarantee the sun will be shining that day. If it doesn't, we offer a money-back guarantee. So please join us at the Science Museum of Virginia to learn about solar 4 weeks from tonight. And I'd really like to thank Aileen, Siobhan Peacock, and Dr. Mary Finley Brooke, who not only put this fantastic program together tonight, but scrambled to make it become virtual. And as I said earlier, that allowed so many more people to have access to it and see it. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon at many, many activities. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Mary and Kyle, Annie. Thank you so much, and Beth as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Great job.
Input too. Okay, thank you. Did a great job.